All right, now to begin with the questions and the answers. First, I am Rabbi Emanuel Schenk. I served as a chaplain in the Army from May 23rd, 1941 until December the 2nd, 1945. In Europe, I was with the 4th Armored Division, a combat unit, and therefore did not stay in any one particular place any great length of time. We spearheaded every major drive of the Third Army and were constantly on the move. Now to come to the questions. One word of explanation. I retired 2.5 years ago. All my records remained at my congregation, filed away in a filing cabinet in Brooklyn, New York. And so what I give you here is completely from memory alone. It would be impossible for me to get back and try to substantiate what I have to say to you from the records that I do have. However, these things were quite vivid in my mind, and I think I can be accurate, except possibly as to exact dates and places. I might add, too, that when the war was over on VE Day, we found ourselves in Czechoslovakia. We first began to run into liberated people or displaced persons or survivors of concentration camps in our drive through Europe. Our division had liberated a small concentration camp in the town of Ohrdruf, O-R-D-R-U-F-F, which was a short distance outside of the city of Gotha. We called it a small concentration camp because we found only about 3,000 bodies there. The bodies were strewn in the courtyard. The SS troops, or the people who guarded the concentration camp, knew that the Americans were coming, and they attempted in a very short time to destroy the evidence. And just outside, or in a corner of the concentration camp, they had put down several rails, metal rails as they have on the railroad, and across these rails they had built bonfires and were burning the bodies. As a matter of fact, they were taking them out of a pit which ran alongside these rails, and there was evidence of the burning of the bodies outside this pit on these rails. But there were still several hundred bodies to be found in the center of the camp itself when we came there. The people in the city there, I believe the closest city was a city called Mühlau, M-U umlaut, H-L-A-U, as did so many of them, claimed complete ignorance of what was going on there, although how they could possibly make such a statement is still not understandable to me at all. As a matter of fact, we were told that our troops insisted that the townspeople, with the officials, the mayor and all, come and visit that camp, and if my memory serves me correctly, the mayor of that town committed suicide shortly thereafter. Incidentally, too, Chaplain Herschel Schachter, who later on did work in Buchenwald and with other displaced persons, came to me when we were outside this camp, and he said, "I heard that you had liberated a camp. Where is it?" And I took him to the camp and showed him, and this was his first, as it had been mine, experience with a concentration camp. And while I'm on the subject of Chaplain Schachter and Buchenwald, let me refer to a publication which the Jewish Welfare Board had put out under the editorship of the late Lee J. Levenger. On the very first page of which, and I quote from memory, It said on April the 12th, exactly one day after Buchenwald was liberated by the 4th Armored Division, Chaplain Herschel Schachter, etc., 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 was the first Jewish chaplain to enter the camp, and so on. I pointed out later on to the Jewish Welfare Board when this article was published, or this booklet was published, that Levinger, who normally is a rather conscientious researcher, had failed in his research on this particular item, and the Jewish Welfare Board was equally at fault. They had all the records of the Jewish chaplains, and they knew, at least their records bore out the fact that there was a Jewish chaplain assigned to the 4th Armored Division, and before this had been published, they should at least have checked into it. It is true that I did no work in Buchenwald with any of the inmates. I couldn't if I had wanted to. I was with the combat troops who liberated it, and since we were in hot pursuit of the enemy, all that we could do was liberate Buchenwald, drop off a company of men to guard it against any possible return of any of the SS men, etc., and we went hot on the trail of those whom we were pursuing. So I didn't do any work in Buchenwald, but that account is slightly inaccurate in that it so happens that I was with the 4th Armored when they liberated Buchenwald, and therefore, for whatever dubious honor may be attached to it, I was the first chaplain to step foot into Buchenwald. Now, to come back to question number 1, we first began to run into individual stragglers when we were, on the eastern section of Germany before we got into Czechoslovakia, where occasionally a straggler would come by. I remember the first one rather vividly. I have pictures of it, but those two are in Brooklyn. Still wearing his concentration camp trousers, but somebody had given him an army jacket. And before he left us, his pockets were bulging with all sorts of K and C rations, whatever the goodies we could possibly give him. I never forget that he came running towards my Jeep. I had a Jewish star on it. And he shouted, of course, Amcho, Amcho. And we spoke a little Yiddish and couldn't get too much information from him. And of course, since we were on the march, I didn't have too much time to spend with him either. On another occasion, in Germany too, we ran across a group of approximately 8 or 10 Romanian girls, ranging in age somewhere between 15 and 25, who had been forced to come on foot from their homes in Romania to work on the farms or in the factories or wherever the Germans wanted to put them. And these were the few miserable survivors. They suffered from malnutrition. They were almost skin and bones when we got to them. Our army doctors examined them, and we managed to place them in homes. I don't remember in what particular town it was in Germany, but we forced the town people to take them into their homes, and we supplied some of the food for them, and we, by threat and intimidation, we told the local people that they had better continue to take care of these girls, and of course we had to go on our way. As I had mentioned at the very beginning of this little narrative, on VE Day, I was in Czechoslovakia. Perhaps a happy circumstance in a town called Horaždovic, and someone told me there that Horaždovic is taken from two words, Horaždvici, the mountain of the Jews. If I'm not mistaken, it was Meyer Levin, who at that time was doing reporting for the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. He happened to be right there in Horaždovic, and he wrote it up and sent it out over the JTA wires, and I believe there was some publicity in the Jewish press in New York, in the United States, because a Jewish chaplain holds services in the surviving synagogue in the town of Horaždovic, and I did, on VE Day, hold a service there. Unfortunately, it could not be held for any of the local inhabitants, because the only surviving Jew in the town of Horajdovic was an old man by the name of Levy, probably in his late 70s, who had been the town butcher for many, many years. His son had married a non-Jewish woman, a Gentile woman, and had continued in his father's footsteps as the town butcher. And because they supplied a vital need, the old man was permitted to continue to live there. The son, the butcher, only a short time before that, was taken to Theresienstadt. His life was spared because he had been married to a non-Jewish woman, had 2 daughters who were baptized and brought up in the Catholic Church. But he was in Theresienstadt, and before I left that area, a week or 10 days later, he had come out of Theresienstadt. That, of course, was the showplace of all the concentration camps, and most of those who did manage to survive Theresienstadt came out in rather good shape. And so I found this synagogue in Horajdovic. The synagogues in Czechoslovakia were spared. They were not destroyed as they had been in Germany for a very practical reason. The synagogues were made good storage places. And as a matter of fact, in the week or 10 days that I was in that area, I found 4 synagogues in 4 different cities, each one of which had been spared, and let me describe them a little. It's an interesting story. Horajdovic, the first one, where I did hold services on VAE Day, was crammed with veterinary supplies. Toward the end, the Germans had run out of motorized equipment in very many areas and had requisitioned horses and other animals, and therefore had to have veterinary supplies for them. The synagogue, with its open space in the middle, of course, provided room for this. The ark, of course, had been desecrated, and there were no ritual objects remaining in there, but this was the synagogue as I found it, and we cleaned out a little bit of spot in front. I brought in my portable ark, my Sefer Torah, and we had a service for our men. In another town not far from there called Strakonitz, Strakonitz had a Fez, F-E-Z, Fez factory in town. And the managers or the owners of the Fez factory had leased the synagogue premises from the German authorities and used it as a storage place for their raw materials. And there were bales and bales of all kinds of wool stuff which were used in the making of the fezzes. This synagogue, too, I had cleaned out. I had the bales taken out. The people of the factory had to arrange to have them removed. We cleaned it out as best we could, and on occasion for our own men, unfortunately there was nobody else, for our own people, we did hold services once or twice before we left the area. A third city was Sushitsa. I believe the German name for that was Schittenhofen. And in Sushitsa, they had stored all the household equipment of the Jewish families that had been taken from that area and sent to concentration camps. The household goods and clothing and shoes and furniture that had belonged to the Jews were stored in that particular synagogue, and it was a beautiful synagogue. And that too we cleaned out as best we could. We did not destroy the household goods, but we had them stored in one particular corner and gathered together in an orderly fashion rather than strewn about as they had been. And there too I ran 1 or 2 services before leaving the area. The fourth town was Volhynia. And here this presented a little more difficult job to clean out. The Germans too had difficulty with their oil supplies, gasoline supplies as we're experiencing it today, and many of their vehicles had been converted to use wood, became wood burners. It reminded me a little bit of the old fire engines that we used to have in New York City that burned coal long before the advent of the storage batteries and electricity and so forth. And in this the synagogue had been leased to a lumber yard, and it was stuffed, literally stuffed, with little pieces of wood, no more than 6 inches long, an inch wide, or an inch cube and 6 inches long. And when I say literally stuffed, it was so filled that we could walk from the balcony of the synagogue right across the entire bottom area, and only a little corner of the ark protruded at the very eastern end of the synagogue. Well, I requisitioned something like a dozen stormtroopers, and they worked 12 hours a day from 8 in the morning till 8 at night, with wheelbarrows working in hand, to empty it and to take these pieces of wood and the supply of wood to the lumberyard, to the owner who owned them. I don't know whether I was being vindictive or not, but I had a little sense of personal satisfaction in seeing these SS men working, and really working, physical labor, to clean out the synagogue. Incidentally, we used SS men at all of these synagogues to clean them out. And when they ran out of cleaning materials, and this perhaps was a little bit personal vindictiveness on my part, but I had seen so much and gone through so much and buried so many of my own boys, since I had been one outfit for all this time. When they ran out of cleaning materials, we simply ripped down the swastikas that were still adorning the walls, and they used those as rags for cleaning up the places. And so I liberated, if you will, 4 synagogues in Czechoslovakia, although I believe it was for a lost cause. No Jews remaining at that time, with the exception of the one that I mentioned that had run across in Horajdovitz, and the son married to a non-Jew. That was my brief experience in Czechoslovakia. Incidentally, in Czechoslovakia, we of course made contact with the Russians. And even then, the stories that we'd heard about the Russians were not the most savory ones that we could possibly hear or experience. After that, it just so happened that my brother, Oliver Shalom, just died last Erev Shavuos. He had been a rabbi in Australia, and he'd been asked by a British jury to come up and run the United Palestine appeal at that time. He, his wife, Faye Schenk, later national president of Hadassah, and Maurice Samuel came to England in 1945 for 2 months to get on the stump and raise money for Palestine. He had written to me from Australia that he would be in London about the 15th of May, and possibly we'd be able to get together. And of course, God was good to us. The war was over on the 9th, and on the 15th of May, I marched into London and spent 2 weeks with him. My sister-in-law met Maurice Samuel, and I didn't do any stumping, but I did get to see some of the Jewish chaplains in the area. When I came back, my outfit, my unit, was no longer in Czechoslovakia, and I finally traced them to Germany. And the 4th Armored Division then went into occupation in an area, in Landshut, Landshut was our division headquarters, and we also had a group in Mainburg, Mainburg, and ranged as far as Regensburg. We went into occupation, as I said, and I, did my chaplain's duties, but was champing at the bit. We had heard that they were discharging men in the United States who had accumulated 60 combat points or combat units. I don't remember exactly how we went about it, a point for each month of service, etc., etc. And I was sitting in Germany with 122 points, anxious to get home to my family. They told me then that they were having a special green project, they called it, to fly back the men with high points, and so I didn't move very far from my home base and passed up opportunities to fly to Palestine at that time. We had an airlift going. As a matter of fact, between there and the time I left Europe to go home in Marseille, I was constantly collecting guns, various arms, and as I said, we had a little contact at that time with Haganah, and I would say that all of these weapons made their way to Palestine and were instrumental in the 48 War of Liberation. But that's now I'm wandering from the point. So we were in occupation in Germany, and then I heard of a young man who was more or less AWOL from his own unit and was busy working with the pitiful remnant of our people in Munich in an attempt to reconcile families, to get them to meet one another. In other words, drawing up lists of survivors. It was Abe Klausner, of course. There wasn't much that I could do. I still had my duties with my outfit, and as I said, I was waiting anxiously from day to day to day, hoping that I would be able to get home. But before I left, I did leave with Abe Klausner all the ritual articles that I had, whatever prayer books and talesim, tefillin, all the religious supplies that I left with him. It was pitiful to see how our people yearned for these ritual articles. There could very possibly have been a black market in them, because fantastic prices were offered for anyone who had a prayer book or a tallis or a chumash or any other religious article. I turned these over to Abe, and Abe did a darn good job. I don't remember how many volumes came out of this She'eri Sapleto, this Saving Remnant, and many families were fortunately reunited because of the labors that he had done there. I personally did not. I had nothing to do in getting packages from the United States, because I was fortunate enough that I would say by July or August at the latest, I was transferred to the 9th Armored Division. As they were going home, the 4th Armored was going to remain in occupation, and they took the High Point men who were due for discharge and transferred them to the 9th, and so I went to the 9th, and we were in the station in Wasserburg in the southern part of Germany, in Bavaria, and I was with them there for less than a month, and again, just did ordinarily chaplain's duty. There weren't too many. I didn't see any, as a matter of fact, refugees or concentration camp survivors in that particular area. So again, I just tended to my normal chaplaincy duties, holding services for as many men as I could gather together from time to time. And as I said earlier, to waiting on pins and needles, but it was not my fortune to be flown home. I went by jeep all the way to Marseille, and in Marseille met Chaplain Abe Hazelcorn, an old friend, and about a week or 10 days we were in the area until finally we went home by ship. And I got home Cholamot Sukkos, 1945. So that I had no great amount of work that I was able to do with the survivors of the concentration camp or with any other of our people in Europe. Fortunately or not, any way you look at it, I was with the combat unit. I could not stay in one spot. I had to move with them when they moved, and about all I could do. Whenever we did run across any of these, and there were other individual occasions, although my memory begins to fail, I do know that since I had been with my particular unit for almost 3 years, or over 3 years, I had access to the quartermasters and to our various cooks and whatever you want to call them, supply people, and I did manage to siphon off supplies of fresh food wherever possible, wherever necessary, and did turn it off to them. I had no problem with any of the GIs when we were able to be of assistance, and non-Jew as well as Jew helped us. The only contact I had with the JDC was on one of these trips from Germany to London, and I did go back incidentally about 2 weeks after I had been with my brother for 2 weeks. Went back for a chaplain's conference on special duty. Stopped off in Paris, and there I met the late Joe Schwartz, who at that time was attempting to recruit people to work with him on the Joint Distribution Committee. And he offered me a position in Paris, but I, of course, refused. I hadn't seen my wife and children in 2 years, and I'd had my belly full of Europe. I wanted to get back home, so I turned him down. I do know that the JDC did do effective work wherever they could get in, and Joe Schwartz, of blessed memory, organized it very well. And that was the only contact that I did have with the JDC during my stay there. I noticed now, I'm almost finished with what I have to say. I noticed in question 16, I did answer something about that. We did collect guns and ammunition to be sent to Palestine. We had a sergeant, not I, Chaplain Hazelcorn in Marseille had a sergeant on his staff, or a sergeant that he knew quite well who was with the Air Force, who made regular weekly trips to Palestine and always brought heavy bundles with him. I know that I helped conduct services on Rosh Hashanah at the port of Marseille, and the boys were all on the way home, and I pointed out to them that guns were illegal in the United States, that it didn't do them much good to have them. And I urged them to turn over their souvenirs to us, and we did gather quite a few guns and rifles, and I believe even some automatic weapons, and we managed to send them on to Palestine. Agavurcho, by the way, I could also add that when I came home during Cholamut Sukkos, hardly the best time in the world for a rabbi to look for a job, I wound up in Gloversville, New York. And for the next few years thereafter, even there I gathered guns and ammunition whenever I ran across one of our men who had brought souvenirs home with him, who came out of the army and had them. We even had one ordnance officer who had 2 full cases of rifles wrapped in cosmoline. I remember putting them in the trunk of my car and bringing them down to New York, where we still had contact with Haganah and turning it over to them. Other than that, I didn't follow through on any more supplies than that. I wouldn't know too much about the role of the American Jewish chaplain during the period of 1944 to 48. We left Europe in September of 45, and I imagine that the replacements who did come in for the combat chaplains were able to do or continue the work that had been started by fellows like Abe Klausner and Abe Hazelcorn and the others who were stationed there. What would have happened had they not been there, I don't know, but possibly the spirit of fair play that our American boys did have might have helped out with some of the survivors. I know that they were all appalled and shocked at the things that they saw, non-Jew as well as Jew, the concentration camps that they did see, and the pitiful survivors that they did run across evoked many feelings of compassion and pity for them, and that's why I said earlier we never had any difficulty with any of them. If we wanted anything and they were in a position to supply it, we got it. In my division particularly, there was no great problem because everything that we had was expendable, and since we were a frontline combat outfit, there was no questioning anything at all about our supplies, how much we used and where we put it and what we did with it. If it was used up, it was just used up, and we were able to get replacements, so there was never any problem in supplies where we did look for them and did want to have them. I think that's about all I have to offer to you. I regret that it has to be so fragmentary and that I can't back it up with specific dates and places. I have a whole collection of pictures of the various events, but these two are packed away with the things that I left in my congregation when I retired 2.5, almost 3 years ago. I hope that even this fragmented report will be of a little bit of assistance to you in your research. This is about all that I can say. I wish you luck. Perhaps someday our paths will cross, and I look forward to meeting you at that time. Respectfully submitted. Thank you.